Hey everybody, how's it going? Todd Swart here, getting started on another painting. Just wanted to show you what I was working on. So this is a little trail scene. This is the original photo. It's down in the Arroyo Seco here in Pasadena. And so I've gotten started on it, did the initial drawing, and blocked in some of the big shapes of tone. So we got our bush areas on the sides with the dark tones and the path in the center. This painting is going to be, at least initially, it's going to be very important to establish the ranges of tones. So if you look in the reference photo here, up close you've got in your foreground areas, you got your darkest tones, your darkest areas in these bushes here, and as you move back in space, those shadow sides of all those bushes get progressively lighter as you go back. And so it's going to be very important to establish those, those layers of tone as you go back. I've got a little bit of that established now in just the block-in, but it's going to be critical in the initial stages of painting, layering in the color. And actually that's what I'm going to start on first, is the color in the shadows, just so I can establish that regression and that atmospheric perspective. Is going to be very important. Okay, so I've got my major shadow tones established, and I know that right now it doesn't look like much. I've just kind of blocked in the biggest shapes of my darkest darks. If you look over in the reference photo, you can see kind of the darkest tones are here and about here. And I know there's a lot of dark tones along this side too, which I've left out because I'm not really too concerned about establishing all the foreground at this point. I just want to establish the relationship between the darkest tone here and here, which is right in the foreground, and then it gets a little bit darker in the middle ground, and in the back foliage it's a little bit lighter, and then my lightest shadow tone, which is up there on the bridge, that's the lightest of all. And I don't know if you can see it, but I also painted in a little bit of the sky, just because I want to make sure that I establish the relationship between that bridge and the sky. This painting, I also did a plein air version of this. I went out and painted it on location, and this was several months ago that I painted this one. But you can see it was a very similar process. My first steps were establishing those dark tones in the front, and then a regressing dark tones as you go back, and then I worked into the rest of the painting. So I think that's a good start. And now I'll just continue blocking in the shapes of those bushes and that trail in the foreground. Okay, so I got most of the major tree shapes blocked in, and let me have you get a look at it here. And so I wanted to point out a couple things. First of all, I left a lot of this background color, that initial scrub, that kind of reddish brown scrub, showing through in those trees. And I did that for a couple reasons. Number one, just because trees, that's kind of the way trees are. You know, there's a lot of stuff in light and background showing through the trees. And so I'm going to go back through and fill in a lot of those gaps with other colors, just because it makes a tree look more natural. And number two, I think that that reddish brown color is actually appropriate for a lot of the color of the trees. I'm actually going to probably leave some of that showing through even in the completed painting. I also wanted to point out the light tones, and kind of a principle that I learned actually from Scott Christensen, an artist that I really respect. And looking over at the reference photo here, what happens with dark tones, the darkest colors are in front, the darkest tones are in front, and then as you go back it gets lighter and lighter. But with light tones it's reversed. So the lightest sunlit areas are here in the foreground, and as you go back, let me switch back over here, the lightest sunlit areas are in the foreground, and as you go back, these sunlit areas back here in those trees in the background, those, like that patch of green right there, that actually represents an area of the tree that's being hit by sunlight, but it's a lot darker than the sunlit patch up here. That's because it's further back, and as those light areas recede, they get darker and they get a little bit redder. And so both of those things together, the receding shadows and the receding light tones work together to create that atmospheric effect. So I wanted to point out one thing real quick. I was working back into some of the shapes of these trees and working on the background areas and this area in particular. So I started working into that and I was trying to match that color. And it can be hard sometimes to match a color that you put down before, but I was doing my best, and then I put down a few strokes here that are a little bit off, and I went to correct it to try to match the original color, but I stopped myself because I know that within that shape, within that shadow tone there, within all these shadow tones, there's going to be a lot of variety. There's going to be a lot of texture, a lot of differences, subtle differences in tone and color. So I'm going to go ahead and keep that quote-unquote incorrect mixture, use that to lay in some smaller shapes inside the bigger shape, and then continue working into it from there. Okay, so I finished the initial block in, and I also went ahead and started to refine or develop the foreground there, and I think the foreground is looking really good. I'm really pleased with that. I'm going to start moving into the background. I'm not at all happy with this area in here, that whole light tone section up there. And I was trying to get an idea about what was wrong there and what I needed to do to fix it. And I think what it is that it's too much of just one solid shape. If you look over here in the reference photo, you can see that you got tree branches passing in front there, but you can also see patches of a hill behind the tree. And there's several variations of tone within those tree branches. So I just need to break up, I think I need to break up that big kind of monolithic shape and also allow a lot more of the background to pass through. Okay, so the blocking is coming along pretty nicely. I wanted to point out one thing, and that is this little line right here. When I blocked that in, I made that line just kind of one continuous kind of even line, which is okay because it's in the right place and the placement is correct. But if you look on the reference photo, there's a lot of variety in that line, right? It's thinner in some places, the angles change a little bit, there's little thick spots. And I think that in the initial block in, it would have been better if I had taken the time to put in a little bit of that variety. So like I say, it's not a big deal. It's going to be fairly easy to correct, but it's a common mistake that I personally make to oversimplify those shapes instead of adding in some of that variety and those changes right from the beginning. Okay, so this painting is coming along pretty nicely. Actually, it's coming along faster than I thought it would, and I really credit that to establishing those tones at the very beginning. That regression of tones I was talking about dark shadows in the foreground and then it gets lighter as you go back. I wanted to point out two things. Number one, in this particular case, normally the darkest shadows would be right in the foreground, which on this painting would be here. But for this particular image, the darkest dark is actually right in this section here, which is a little bit further back in the scene. And the reason I did that is because the light is coming from over on this side. The light's pointing this direction and the light's hitting the ground here, and some of that light is reflecting back up into those shadow areas. So for this scene, it's these shadows over here on the shadow side of the path that actually have the darkest tones, even though they're a little bit further back. The other thing I wanted to point out was that bridge. So I've been doing some work on the bridge and I think it's coming along pretty nicely. And I'm looking at these support pieces, these beams that just come straight down, those thin little beams. From a distance, I think those read really nicely, but if you look up close, you can see those are really just kind of smears. If you look at the reference photo, if you look up in close there, you can see those little beams are really clearly defined. You can see the edges, you can see them really nicely defined, and that's the way I painted them at first. But when I did that, when you step back, those beams, the hard edges on those beams really kind of distracted from the rest of the painting. So I really softened those edges and really kind of just painted over the entire beam with that sky color, and I think it shows up now, it reads now much more nicely. Okay, so this painting is coming along pretty nicely. Actually, it's coming along, it's kind of surprised me, it's come along better than I thought it would at pretty much every phase of the painting. I'm really pleased with how it's coming out. I wanted just to point out a couple things. The stage where I'm at now, I think I really need to focus on kind of the transition areas. So I'm looking at like this area here between this light middle ground and this little darker background. If you look over in the reference photo, you see all kinds of nice little subtle changes, you know, little divots and ins and outs and places where the background peeked through the leaves of the middle ground there. And I've got some of that, but I really want to build that up and just kind of refine that transition zone, make it a little more natural. Very similar down here along the side of the path. I've got almost kind of a clean edge along that path there. If you look in the photo, the edge of that path, and you always see this in pathways and trails, is it's very kind of jagged. Like it's not just a clean line. There's branches that are little leaves and twigs that stick out, and there's sections of earth and path that jut into the bush areas. So I want to indicate a lot of those changes there along the edge of that path. And then also the last thing I wanted to look at was the railing. So I added this nice detail of the railing up here on the top of the bridge. And remember before I was talking about how I broke down the edges of these posts here and made them a lot softer edges, almost blurry. I really just wanted to look at kind of how, without that, I haven't done that yet for the railing, and I just wanted to point out that you can see how kind of a little bit too harsh that railing appears at this point. It'll help a lot to break up a lot of those edges so that it matches kind of the feel of this area in here, where those thin sections of bridge are kind of dissolved into the sky zone. Alright, so I think I'm about ready to call this one done. This painting has been a lot of fun. It's kind of surprised me throughout. The first 3/4 of it went a lot quicker than I thought it would, and then the last quarter actually took me a lot longer than I thought. So this painting, a painting like this, has a lot of really subtle transitions. I don't know if you can see in there, a lot of just real subtle shifts in temperature, in tone, in color. So it makes for interesting work. Also a lot of nice detail up in that bridge. That was a lot of fun to work on as well. So I also want to give you a preview of my next painting. It's this nice little city scene I found down in Old Town Pasadena. Got some of that cool early morning sunlight shining through the buildings there. So I hope that you have enjoyed this video. If you have, I hope you'll give it a like and click that subscribe button. And thanks for watching.